Prologue. What moves first? There are things that only move once you leave. They do not pursue, they do not resist, they wait patiently, like systems calibrated for absence rather than presence. They respond not to motion, but to the decision to stop being still. Juliet felt it somewhere between the ferry and the first stretch of mainland highway when the smell of salt gave way to oil and wet concrete, and the world stopped buffering itself for her nervous system. The cabin had not healed her. It had contained her. That mattered more than anyone liked to admit. Containment ends when you move. Night came faster now, harder. Without water nearby, sleep lost its edges, dreams sharpened. They no longer wandered. They arrived with purpose. Streets that refused to stay empty, hospital corridors lit too brightly, voices that knew her cadence even when they didn't use her name. She woke with her body already braced. Elias always woke first. Not because he was afraid, because he had learned that the most dangerous moments weren't loud, they were transitional. The breath before a sound, the fraction of a second when someone reached for grounding and didn't know where it would land. He made himself available without enclosure. Hands close but not claiming, presence offered, never imposed. It was discipline, not gentleness, and it was costing him more now that stillness was gone. Kat noticed the cost immediately. She noticed how Juliet stopped shrinking and started choosing. Where she stood, who she leaned against, when she used humor like a blade instead of a shield. She noticed Elias's restraint becoming visible, like tension carried openly rather than buried. She noticed how proximity stopped pretending to be incidental. Kat had lived her life inside motion. Leaving didn't scare her. What interested her was what movement revealed, how it stripped away the fiction of patience, how it made desire audible without offering relief. She liked that this was getting harder. Elsewhere, far north of comfort, far south of myth, systems adjusted. Myth did not wake because someone invoked it. It woke because avoidance reached critical mass, because intent went unacted on long enough to begin distorting the space around it. Myth, after all, is not intervention. It is pressure feedback, and it responds to vectors. In Moscow, Sergei Smirnova stood at his office window and watched traffic dissolve into slush. He held a tablet loosely in one hand, thumb resting on a file that refused to behave. Names that should have gone quiet hadn't. Supply chains that should have smoothed themselves had instead begun to loop. Not errors, patterns. The kind that emerged when people thought they were being careful rather than honest. One name in particular refused to settle: Elias O'Toole. Smirnova did not smile. Smiles were wasteful. He exhaled slowly, considering the geometry. A man who refused escalation. A woman who should have broken and hadn't. Another woman who complicated matters simply by existing without apology. Interesting, he said softly. He did nothing. Yet. Pressure worked best when it arrived disguised as coincidence. Closer, but still not close enough, Bethany Winter cross-checked a shipping discrepancy for the fourth time and felt the quiet resistance of something that didn't want to be named yet. Not proof, not danger, just a refusal to resolve. She logged it anyway. That mattered. Back on the road, rain threaded itself across the windshield in steady, exhausting lines. Brian Eno. An ending. Ascent. Juliet watched the world blur and realized the ache wasn't for the lake. It was for the version of herself who hadn't had to negotiate every sensory input, who hadn't had to choose so deliberately. Elias drove without urgency, jaw tight, hands steady. Kat stretched in the back seat, barefoot, entirely at ease with the closeness, with the tension, with the knowledge that this was no longer a retreat. It was a trajectory. The cabin had been insulation. This was exposure, and exposure once begun does not ask whether you're ready. Chapter 1. You can't take the lake with you. Alternate cabins are a controlled substance. The cabin did not object when they packed it. This was the first lie. Juliet moved through the rooms as if touching artifacts in a museum she had been evacuated from. The kettle cooled on the stove. The couch held the shape of its last occupant with a stubbornness that felt personal. The window over the sink reflected a version of her that had learned how to stand without bracing. She did not look at the lake. She had learned carefully that eye contact mattered. Kat handled the logistics with a competence that felt almost theatrical in its calm. Lists appeared. Bags were redistributed until weight became an abstract concept rather than a threat. She moved easily through space, bare feet on wood, nudity incidental and unremarked, as if the cabin itself had adjusted its rules around her presence. Elias checked exits. Not because he expected trouble, because movement changed the math. He catalogued angles and sightlines out of habit, the way some people recited prayers they no longer believed in but weren't prepared to abandon. His restraint, so effortless at the lake, had sharpened into something more brittle. He kept his hands busy. He kept his voice level. Gordon Lightfoot, If You Could Read My Mind. The song drifted from nowhere in particular, as if the cabin had decided to make one last pointed observation. "If I leave the coffee," Juliet said, gesturing vaguely toward the counter, "will it miss me?" Kat didn't smile. She tilted her head, considering. "It'll miss the routine, objects like repetition." Juliet nodded, filing this away with other truths she hadn't known she needed. The drive away was worse than the packing. Trees thinned, water receded. The road widened into something with opinions. Juliet's body noticed before her mind did. Her shoulders climbed. Her jaw locked. The quiet she'd learned to trust began to peel away, replaced by a static hum that had nothing to do with sound. Elias drove. Kat navigated. Juliet watched the rearview mirror until the cabin stopped appearing in it, and then she stopped looking altogether. They reached the ferry terminal mid-morning, which was to say, crowded enough to be a problem, orderly enough to disguise it. Engines idled. Children cried. Someone dropped a coffee with the deliberate timing of fate. Juliet's breath shortened, her senses flaring outward, grasping for the water that was no longer close enough to argue with her brain. Kat noticed first, not because Juliet made noise, she didn't, but because her posture changed. Kat adjusted without comment, stepping slightly closer, body angled not to block, but to buffer. She handed Juliet a boarding pass like a talisman. "Focus on the rectangle," she said quietly. "Paper is honest." Juliet nodded. It helped. A little. Elias watched the exits. He watched the way people moved when they thought no one was paying attention. He watched the man who kept checking his phone too often, the woman whose bag didn't match her pace. None of it rose to threat. All of it mattered anyway. Enya, Orinoco Flow. It came over the ferry radio like a personal insult. "Oh, come on," Kat muttered, not unkindly. "That's just cruel." Juliet laughed, once, sharp and surprised, and the sound grounded her more effectively than any breathing exercise had managed. Humor, she was learning, could be a rope. The ferry lurched into motion. The water returned, not close, but present enough to register. Juliet's nervous system eased by degrees. She stood at the railing, wind tugging at her jacket, eyes tracking the churned wake as if it might explain itself. Crowds pressed behind her, voices overlapped. A man leaned too close. Her hand moved before she thought about it. Elias felt it immediately, the brief, deliberate contact at his fingers, a question disguised as certainty. He answered without tightening, without claiming. Their hands met and separated in less than a second. It was enough. Juliet exhaled, shoulders dropping a fraction. She did not look at him. She did not need to. Kat saw everything. She said nothing. Trooper Santa Maria. The song bounced cheerfully through the passenger deck, all earnest bravado and maritime metaphor. Kat snorted. "If this gets any more on the nose, I'm suing the universe." Juliet smiled. Elias almost did. The land fell away. The lake, did not follow. Juliet felt it then. The precise moment absence asserted itself. Not grief, not fear. Something closer to offense, as if the ground itself had noted her departure and was keeping score. She leaned against the railing and let the water do what it could from a distance. Elias stood nearby, not touching, not leaving. Kat flanked them both, already oriented toward what came next. Behind them, the cabin waited, not abandoned, just no longer containing. And somewhere in the quiet space where water met wake, something recalibrated, patient, attentive, unimpressed by sentiment. You couldn't take the lake with you, but it noticed when you left. Chapter 2. Cities are loud on purpose. Alternate urban planning by malice. The city announced itself before it was visible. Juliet felt it as pressure, air that didn't circulate properly, sound that stacked instead of dissipated. The ferry terminal had been a warning. The drive inland was the verdict. By the time they reached the lower mainland, her nervous system had already begun drafting formal complaints. Concrete replaced trees. Angles sharpened. Light reflected instead of softened. Kat directed them through traffic with surgical confidence, her voice calm, precise, laced with a faint, almost playful irritation at inefficiency. She had changed clothes somewhere between the ferry and the city. Loose trousers, a coat worn open, the quiet authority of someone who refused to dress defensively. Elias parked the car and immediately clocked the building. 4 stories, old concrete, windows that pretended to be symmetrical. He noted the alley, the stairwell, the roof access he hoped they wouldn't need. Juliet stood very still on the sidewalk, keys digging into her palm. "This place hates us already," she said. Kat glanced up at the facade. "It doesn't hate us. It just doesn't care." That feels worse. Inside, the safe house smelled like dust and old heat. Someone had tried to make it neutral. Beige walls, sturdy furniture, nothing memorable. But neutrality, Juliet was learning, was a choice that took effort. The silence inside was not lake silence. It was waiting room silence, the kind that assumed something would go wrong eventually. The tragically hip Wheat Kings. Kat turned the radio on immediately, volume low, almost apologetic. The song filled the space with restrained sorrow and civic failure. Juliet exhaled without realizing she'd been holding her breath. "Canada really leaned into melancholia," she murmured. "It's our brand," Kat said. "We export it quietly." They attempted routine. This was a mistake. Juliet unpacked and repacked the same bag twice, unable to decide where things belonged when the space refused to acknowledge her presence. The kettle whistled too sharply. The refrigerator hummed like it was judging her. Every sound arrived without permission. Elias set up his workstation with practiced economy, cables aligned, screens angled just so. Online, at least, the world still obeyed rules. He kept his back to the wall, not because it mattered here, but because his body insisted. Night fell abruptly, city lights snapping on like a dare. Bill Evans, piano drifting through the walls. Someone nearby had taste, or insomnia. Juliet lay on the bed she now shared with Elias, familiar only in its continuity, not its comfort. The mattress was firmer. The sheets smelled like detergent instead of lake air. Her body remembered water and found none. Kat paused in the doorway, hair damp from a shower she'd taken with deliberate slowness, as if to remind the space who was in charge. "Protocol check," she said lightly, "before we pretend this is normal." Juliet turned her head. Elias sat on the edge of the bed, boots off, shoulders rigid. "Door's locked," Kat continued. "Phone's off except emergency line. If anyone wakes up disoriented, you say it out loud. No heroics, no assumptions." Her gaze flicked between them. Consent is explicit. Touch is negotiated. Nightmares do not give anyone a free pass. Juliet swallowed. "Thank you." Kat smiled. Not warm, not cold. Accurate. "I'm taking the couch, not because I have to, because I want to." Elias nodded once, grateful and frustrated in equal measure. The lights went out. The city did not. Sirens stitched the dark together. A car alarm panicked 3 blocks away. Somewhere someone laughed too loudly, too late. Juliet's dreams came fast and sharp, unfiltered by water or distance. She was running, she was cornered, the floor was concrete, and it remembered every fall. She woke with a sound caught halfway between breath and scream. Elias was upright instantly, hands visible, voice low. "Juliet, you're here, it's me." She nodded, eyes unfocused. Don't touch yet." "I won't." The space between them vibrated with things unsaid, heat without direction, want without permission. Her leg brushed his accidentally, and both of them froze, hyper-aware of the contact. It took effort not to laugh. The cult, She Sells Sanctuary. It pulsed faintly through the walls, all ritual and tension, a song that promised things no one intended to deliver. Kat groaned audibly from the couch. "Oh, for fuck's sake," she called. "Of course it's that." Juliet huffed, the sound shaky but real. She lay back down closer to Elias than before, close enough to feel warmth without ownership. "Cities are loud on purpose," she murmured. "They don't want you listening inward." Elias stared at the ceiling. "They succeed more often than not." Sleep came in fragments. When morning arrived, it did so without ceremony. No mist, no birds worth naming, just light through blinds and the sense that something essential had been misfiled. Juliet sat up slowly, testing herself. Her body ached, not injured, just unmoored. Elias handed her coffee without comment, their fingers brushing for half a second longer than necessary. Kat watched, amused, sharp-eyed, saying nothing. Outside, the city waited, and somewhere far from water, something patient adjusted its expectations. Chapter 3. The Email That Shouldn't Exist. Alternate, "Dear Mr. O'Toole, fancy a chat?" Elias had been awake for 40 minutes when the email arrived. Not because he needed to be, sleep was available, technically, but because the city made a noise that lived just under thought, a frequency that nudged his body into readiness whether his mind agreed or not. He had accepted that years ago. You didn't argue with certain instincts. You just arranged your life around them. The workstation was the one part of the safe house that behaved. Screens aligned, cables obeyed. The chair remembered his posture like a promise. He put Rush on out of spite. Subdivisions was a public service announcement disguised as a song, and let the familiar indictment of fluorescent conformity hum behind his thoughts. Juliet hovered nearby, wrapped in one of Kat's sweaters, the sleeves too long, the hem indecent in a way that was entirely accidental and therefore dangerous. She held her coffee with both hands, absorbing warmth like it was medicine. Kat was on the couch, boots off, feet up, pretending not to watch anything while clocking everything. Elias opened the inbox. He didn't flinch. That was the tell. Juliet saw it anyway. The email header was correct. Too correct. The address resolved cleanly through channels it had no business knowing existed. The encryption was elegant, restrained. Not a threat. An invitation. Subject line, a professional curiosity. Elias leaned back a fraction of an inch. That was new. He read it once, then again, slower. "Mr. O'Toole, I hope this message finds you well, or at least productively occupied. We appear to be observing the same absences. I find that statistically interesting. I would welcome a brief exchange of perspectives. No commitments implied. S." Silence thickened. Miles Davis slid in like a hand on the back of the neck in a silent way, all restraint and implication, music that understood the value of not arriving. Juliet crossed the room without thinking. She didn't touch Elias. She didn't need to. She leaned close enough to read his micro-responses instead. The tightening at the corner of his mouth, the stillness in his shoulders, the way his breathing recalibrated. "That's him," she said quietly. "Yes." Kat finally looked up. "Male," she said, smug but careful, likes semicolons. "Polite," Juliet added. "Which is worse?" Elias closed the laptop halfway, not in retreat, but in pause. "He shouldn't know I exist." Kat smiled without humor. People like him treat "shouldn't" as a suggestion. Juliet's gaze stayed on Elias. "What does he want?" "To see if I'll blink." "And will you?" Elias met her eyes. There it was. The unguarded moment. Not fear. Calculation layered over something warmer, something that cost him more than he ever let show. "No," he said, "but I also won't bare my teeth." Kat snorted. "You say that like it's not your most attractive quality." Juliet's lips twitched. "Is that what we're calling it now?" The room shifted, just enough. Sexual tension didn't announce itself. It rearranged furniture quietly and waited for someone to trip. Elias reopened the laptop, fingers hovering. He typed a reply with infuriating calm. Mr. S., curiosity is rarely mutual, but I'm open to data. Boundaries are non-negotiable. EO. He didn't send it right away. Juliet leaned closer, her shoulder nearly brushing his. The warmth between them was unmistakable now, a line drawn and redrawn without contact. She lowered her voice. You don't have to answer today. I know, but you will. Yes. Kat stood, stretching deliberately, the movement a reminder of bodies and choices, and the fact that restraint was an active process. I'm going to make more coffee, she said, because this is officially interesting. When she passed behind Elias, she let her hand hover near his shoulder, never touching, never asking. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. The awareness was mutual and sharp and entirely unresolved. The email sent with a soft sound that felt louder than it should have. Outside, the city continued its argument with itself. Somewhere else, a man named Smirnova smiled at a screen, not because he'd won, but because the game had finally acknowledged him. Juliet took a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She reached out, just for a second, and rested her fingers against Elias's wrist. Thank you, she said. Not for the email, for everything else. He turned his hand slightly, a question. She nodded. The contact held, brief, grounding, charged, and then released. The city listened.